The cabin lights dimmed, the engines hummed, and the passengers settled into their seats. But what happened next would not only shake everyone on board, it would shake an entire airline to its core. Adrian sat quietly in first class, his posture calm, his presence unassuming. To most passengers, he looked like any other young traveler. No flashy chains, no loud voice, no entourage, just a man with headphones in, staring out the window. Nobody knew who he was or who his father was. Until Sophie, the flight attendant, made the mistake of her life. It began with something small. A drink request dismissed. A tone that cut sharper than it needed to. A careless glare. And then crack. Sophie's hand whipped across Adrian's face. The sound echoed through the cabin, followed by gasps of disbelief. Passengers froze. Some reached for their phones, but Adrian didn't shout. He didn't argue. He didn't even flinch. He simply lowered his gaze, slipped his hand into his pocket, and made one call. That call didn't just travel through the plane's thin airwaves. It traveled across cities, across borders, until it reached Marcus, the man who built empires, who could move markets with a single decision. Adrian never leaned on his father's power. He never had to. But this time was different. This time, silence wasn't enough. Within minutes, alarms went off in executive offices. Within hours, boardrooms turned into war rooms. And within a single day, an entire airline, one of the biggest in the world, found itself collapsing under the weight of a single slap. Why did Adrian stay so calm when humiliation burned in front of hundreds of eyes? What did Marcus say when he answered his son's call? And what happened to Sophie, the woman whose arrogance lit the fuse of destruction? This isn't just a story about wealth and influence. It's about dignity, respect, and the devastating price of prejudice when directed at the wrong person. One slap. One call, one shutdown. The question is, what really happened inside that cabin? And what was the true cost of Sophie's mistake? Stay with me, because once you hear how this story unfolds, you'll never look at flying or power the same way again. Adrian Holt wasn't the kind of man people expected to carry the weight of power. At 26, he lived quietly, far from the boardrooms and cameras that followed his father, Marcus Holt, the billionaire whose companies stretched across continents. Adrian could have chosen to be a headline, a constant presence in tabloids, surrounded by luxury and extravagance. Instead, he chose something different. He lived in quiet discipline. Every morning before the city woke, Adrian jogged through the park near his apartment. Not a mansion, not a penthouse. Just a simple, modern apartment he paid for himself, despite never needing to. He believed in earning dignity, not inheriting it. In the evenings, he'd sit in small cafes, reading or working on projects most people didn't even know about. Community initiatives. Scholarships for kids who reminded him of himself. Kids who grew up with whispers about whether they belonged, who were told doors weren't meant to open for them. Adrian wanted to be the one holding those doors open. But no matter how humble he kept his life, people sometimes looked at him differently. A security guard who shadowed him too closely at a store. A business associate who seemed shocked when he spoke with knowledge and authority. He was used to the subtle weight of suspicion. He carried it quietly, with patience. Still, there were moments, even for someone as composed as Adrian, where the sting of prejudice cut deeper than he let on. He had once told a close friend, "It's not always the big things that hurt. It's the small ones. The way people look at you like you're out of place, like you don't belong, even when you've done everything right." His father, Marcus Holt, knew this world well. He had clawed his way to the top, building an empire brick by brick in industries that once shut their doors on men who looked like him. He was feared and respected in boardrooms, but he never forgot the sneers, the rejections, the racism that tried to stop him before he became unstoppable. For Marcus, power was protection. For Adrian, restraint was, and so Adrian never flaunted his name. When he booked his ticket on that flight, he used no special privilege, no connections. Just another traveler, seat 2A. Nobody on that plane knew they were sitting beside the son of Marcus Holt. That anonymity was both a shield and a risk. Because not everyone saw Adrian for who he was. Some only saw what they wanted to see. And on this flight, that perception would ignite into something ugly, something that would test the limits of patience, dignity, and power. The cabin crew bustled with their routines. Smiles plastered on, voices polished into politeness. Among them was Sophie Grant. To most passengers, she looked like the perfect professional. Uniform crisp, hair tied neatly back, her voice clear and sharp. But beneath that polished surface lay something else, an impatience sharpened by prejudice she would never admit aloud. For now, everything seemed ordinary. The hum of engines, the clink of glasses, passengers scrolling through phones, parents soothing children, couples whispering over shared headphones. Adrian leaned back in his seat, calm, headphones resting around his neck, gaze fixed on the clouds outside the window. He had no idea that in just minutes, one moment would shatter the illusion of normalcy. One slap would draw a line between ordinary life and the storm that was about to begin. The seatbelt sign dimmed. A calm murmur spread through the cabin as passengers began to relax into the flight. Adrian adjusted his headphones, sinking slightly into the soft leather of his first-class seat. To him it was just another journey, quiet, uneventful. Or so he thought. Sophie walked the aisle with a tray of drinks, her practiced smile flashing briefly at each passenger. But when her eyes landed on Adrian, something in her gaze shifted, tightened. She paused. "Excuse me," Adrian said politely, removing his headphones. "Could I have a glass of water, please?" Sophie's smile didn't reach her eyes. She gave a short, clipped nod and moved on without a word. Adrian raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Small slights were nothing new. He had learned long ago that not every insult deserved his energy. Minutes later, Sophie returned with drinks for the passengers around him. She placed a sparkling water for the woman across the aisle, a soda for the businessman behind him. But Adrian's request, ignored. He pressed the call button. The soft chime rang through the cabin. Sophie turned, her jaw tightening, and walked back toward him. "Yes?" she said sharply. "Sorry to bother you," Adrian replied, calm but firm. "I asked for some water earlier. Could I have that now?" The air between them crackled with unspoken tension. Passengers glanced up, sensing something off. Sophie let out a short, almost mocking laugh. "I'll get to it when I can." "You'll need to be patient," Adrian exhaled slowly. He could feel the stares, the silent question in the eyes of those around him. Why is she treating him this way? It didn't take long for things to escalate. At meal service, Sophie placed trays delicately in front of each first-class passenger. But when she reached Adrian, she slammed the tray down with a clatter, spilling juice across the tablecloth. Gasps broke out nearby. Adrian's shirt caught a spray of liquid staining the fabric. "Careful," Adrian said, startled. "Maybe keep your hands to yourself next time," Sophie shot back, her voice carrying just enough for others to hear. The businessman behind Adrian shook his head in disbelief. The woman across the aisle whispered to her husband, "What is wrong with her?" Adrian's chest tightened. It wasn't the juice. It wasn't the water. It was the sting of familiarity, how quickly respect could evaporate when prejudice crept in. But Adrian held his composure. He dabbed at his shirt with a napkin, forcing himself to remain silent. He knew anger would only confirm the narrative Sophie had already written in her mind, yet silence didn't stop her. Each interaction became sharper, more hostile. When Adrian reached for his overhead bag, Sophie blocked the aisle, snapping, "Passengers should remain seated." When he shifted his seat slightly, she scolded, "Sir, other guests are trying to rest. Please control yourself." Her voice wasn't just for him. It was for everyone else. The kind of public humiliation designed to make him look difficult, unworthy of the seat he'd paid for. Adrian could feel it working. He could feel the shift in the room. Some passengers avoided his gaze, choosing not to get involved. Others whispered, unsure of what they were witnessing. A young boy across the aisle looked at him with wide, confused eyes, as if asking silently, "Why is she being so mean to you?" The weight pressed heavy on Adrian's chest. His heart raced. Memories clawed at the back of his mind. Moments from his past when teachers had doubted him, when store clerks had followed him, when strangers had crossed the street to avoid him. Always the same shadow, always the same question hanging in the air. Do you belong here? And then came the breaking point. Adrian pressed the call button again, his voice steady. "Excuse me, ma'am. I'd like to speak to the lead attendant, please." Sophie froze. For a heartbeat, her face hardened. Then, in front of everyone, she snapped, "You people are always so demanding. Sit down and wait like everyone else." The words cut like glass. Gasps erupted. A woman covered her mouth. A man muttered, "Unbelievable." Phones began to rise into the air, passengers recording. The tension was no longer invisible. It was undeniable. Adrian's breath caught. The humiliation wasn't just his anymore. It was public. It was raw. It was on display for the world to see. And then, it happened. Sophie leaned closer, her face inches from his, and hissed words only he could hear. "Know your place." The slap came a second later. Sharp, sudden, echoing. Passengers erupted in shock. Some shouted, others gasped so loud the sound seemed to rattle the cabin. A child began crying. Adrian didn't move, didn't strike back, didn't raise his voice. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed one number. As the ringtone echoed in his ear, passengers whispered, "Who is he calling? Is he okay? Did that really just happen?" And when the line clicked open, Adrian said only one sentence. "Dad, it's happened again." Marcus Holt's silence on the other end was more terrifying than words, because when Marcus finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, and dangerous. "Stay calm, son. The airline won't survive this." The Hilo cabin was silent, save for the hum of the engines and the pounding of Adrian's heartbeat. The sting of Sophie's hand still burned across his cheek, but it wasn't the physical pain that cut deepest. It was the memory. The memory of every time he had swallowed disrespect, every time he had endured prejudice with a forced calm, every time he had chosen silence over chaos. But this time was different. This wasn't a quiet street corner or a private office. This was a plane full of witnesses, their phones raised, their disbelief recorded in shaky hands. This humiliation had nowhere to hide. Sophie stood above him, her chest heaving, her jaw clenched tight with defiance. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross, but in her eyes, Adrian wasn't worth her regret. She straightened her uniform, as if she had simply corrected a misbehaving child. "Sit down and keep quiet," she hissed, her voice trembling with arrogance. Adrian didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He simply lifted the phone closer to his ear, his father's voice steady on the other end. "Son, do you trust me?" Adrian closed his eyes briefly. He thought of his childhood, Marcus teaching him that dignity was not given, it was defended. He thought of the lessons about restraint, about choosing battles wisely. But he also thought of his father's scars, the ones the world couldn't see, carved by decades of prejudice. "Yes, Dad," Adrian whispered. "Then stay seated. I'll handle the rest." And with those words, Marcus Holt, a man whose voice could rattle governments and shake industries, went to war. Back on the ground, chaos began to unfold in silence. Within minutes of Marcus's first call, lawyers were dispatched. News outlets received anonymous tips about an incident on Flight 237. Social media lit up with fragments of video posted by passengers mid-air. Sophie slamming the tray, Sophie's sharp words, Sophie's hand striking Adrian's face. The hashtag was born before the plane even touched the runway. One slap. On board. Whispers spread like wildfire. Passengers leaned across aisles, asking each other in hushed voices, "Who is he? Did you see what she said? This is going viral." Sophie's facade of control began to crack. She noticed the cameras trained on her every move. The eyes of the passengers weren't neutral anymore. They were judging, condemning, recording history she couldn't erase. "Stop filming," she barked, her voice rising. "You can't record crew without permission." But nobody listened. The more she protested, the more phones tilted toward her. Her power had vanished in the space of seconds, replaced by a digital jury she could not silence. As the plane touched down, the cabin crew prepared for landing, but the usual routine was drowned by the tension. Passengers refused to look at Sophie. Some glared openly. Others whispered about lawsuits, about headlines. Adrian remained silent. His calmness unnerved her more than if he had shouted, because silence, in that moment, was power. When the plane's doors opened, it wasn't just passengers waiting at the gate. A wave of security and executives rushed forward, their polished shoes and expensive suits moving with panic. They knew who Adrian was now. They knew exactly what was at stake. "Mr. Holt," one executive stammered, eyes wide. "Please, allow us to explain." Adrian didn't even look at him. He simply handed his phone to the man, Marcus's voice still on the line. The executive paled, clutching the phone as if it were a loaded weapon. The terminal grew crowded. Cameras flashed. News crews who had caught wind of the story gathered. Like vultures, microphones raised, voices shouting questions. And then it happened. Marcus Holt arrived. The billionaire didn't come with fanfare. He didn't need it. His presence was enough to part the crowd. Dressed in a dark tailored suit, eyes burning with cold fury, he walked straight through the chaos and stopped in front of Adrian. For a moment, father and son stood together in silence. Adrian's cheek was still marked red from Sophie's hand. Marcus lifted a hand, gently touching his son's face, his expression unreadable. Then Marcus turned to the executives, to Sophie, to the swarm of cameras now pointed at them. His voice, low and controlled, cut through the noise. "My son asked for water. He received violence. He asked for respect. He received humiliation. This is not about one flight attendant. This is about a system that still believes dignity is optional for people like us." The crowd hushed. Even Sophie's defiance faltered, her face draining of color. Marcus's voice sharpened. "So hear me now. This airline is finished. Before this day ends, your stocks will fall, your investors will vanish, and your board will beg for mercy. And when they ask why, tell them it was because one employee thought prejudice had no price." Sophie's mouth opened, but no words came out. The executives fumbled with apologies, but Marcus's words had already sealed their fate. The cameras caught every second, every syllable, every flash of humiliation across their faces. Adrian, still seated, finally stood. He didn't speak to Sophie. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. His father's presence, the world's attention, and the undeniable evidence spoke louder than anything he could have said. As they walked out together, flashes erupted, hashtags trended, and a corporation that had once thought itself untouchable began to crumble. But for Adrian, the victory wasn't in the downfall of an airline. It was in the quiet truth that he didn't have to lower himself to fight. His dignity had survived the slap. His silence had spoken louder than Sophie's arrogance, and his father's power had ensured the world would never forget. One slap, one caw, one empire falling, and the question lingered in every headline, every whispered conversation, every trembling executive's mind. If this is what happens when you humiliate his son, what happens when you cross Marcus Holt himself? The silence after Marcus's words felt heavier than the roar of the engines that had carried the passengers across the skies. For a moment, the bustling terminal froze, executives staring wide-eyed, cameras flashing in relentless bursts, passengers whispering as if they had just witnessed history being written. Sophie stood in the center of it all, her uniform suddenly feeling less like authority and more like a cage. Her face was pale, her defiance gone. She had slapped one man, but the echo of that action now reverberated across continents. She had awakened a storm that no airline, no corporation, no institution could contain. Adrian, standing silently beside. His father felt the weight lift from his shoulders, not because justice was instant, but because truth was undeniable. For once, the world had seen what so many tried to dismiss. The humiliation wasn't his burden alone. It was public, it was recorded, and it demanded accountability. Within 24 hours, the videos from Flight 237 were everywhere. News anchors replayed the slap in slow motion, dissecting Sophie's words, passengers' gasps, and Marcus's chilling vow. Hashtags trended across every platform. One slap, respect dignity, Holt vs. Airline. Stock prices plummeted as investors scrambled. Advertisers pulled contracts, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. By the end of the week, the airline's CEO had resigned, several executives were dismissed, and Sophie was suspended pending investigation. But it wasn't just about punishment. It was about exposure. For years, whispers about discrimination in first-class cabins had gone unheard. Now, the world had proof. This single flight became the lightning rod for every ignored complaint, every silenced passenger. Class actions were filed, lawsuits stacked high. The airline's empire, once untouchable, was now crumbling brick by brick. Yet Adrian himself avoided the spotlight. Journalists begged for interviews, but he declined them all. To him, the story wasn't about fame or revenge. It was about dignity. He refused to let his life become a spectacle for clicks and ratings. Instead, he focused on the voices that rose after his. Messages poured in from strangers, passengers who had faced similar humiliation, employees who had been mistreated because of the color of their skin, children who finally saw someone stand against prejudice with calm strength. One evening, Adrian scrolled through hundreds of messages and paused on a note from a 12-year-old boy. "When I saw what happened to you, I thought, that's me too. People treat me like I don't belong. But you didn't fight back with anger. You showed me I don't have to lose myself to prove I belong. Thank you." Adrian sat back, tears stinging his eyes. In that moment, he understood. The true power wasn't in bringing down an airline. It was in lifting others who carried the same scars. Marcus Holt was no stranger to storms. He had weathered markets, governments, and betrayal. But this was different. This was personal. He did not rest until the airline had not only paid damages, but also restructured its training, its policies, and its accountability systems. He used his influence not to destroy blindly, but to demand reform. Every public appearance he made carried the same refrain. Prejudice does not just insult individuals. It weakens communities. It robs industries of trust. It poisons generations. If one slap can bring down an empire, imagine what dignity and unity can build. His words resonated far beyond the aviation industry. Universities invited him to speak. Community leaders echoed his call. And slowly, the story of one man's humiliation turned into a movement for collective dignity. Months later, the airline was still reeling. New leadership scrambled to rebuild trust, offering apologies, implementing diversity programs, and pledging change. But reputation once lost is not so easily repaired. The shadow of Flight 237 lingered, a permanent scar on the company's history. For Sophie, the consequences were inevitable. Dismissed from her position, she became the face of arrogance and unchecked prejudice. Interviews she attempted to give only fueled outrage. Where she had once worn a uniform of authority, she now carried the burden of being remembered as the woman who slapped dignity itself. But the story didn't end with her fall. It stretched further, into homes, into classrooms, into conversations where parents and children asked, why would she treat him like that? Why do people think they can? How can we stop it? Flight 237 became more than a scandal. It became a mirror, forcing society to confront its reflection. For Adrian, healing didn't come overnight. The slap had reopened wounds that ran deep. Wounds not just his, but his community's, his father's, his ancestors'. But with time, he found strength in knowing he hadn't responded with rage. He had chosen restraint, and in that restraint, he had revealed the ugliness for the world to see. He went back to his quiet routines, morning jogs, evenings in cafes, community projects. But now, wherever he went, people recognized him. Some whispered, some thanked him, some simply nodded with unspoken respect. And in those nods, Adrian found peace. Because respect that is freely given is far greater than respect that is demanded. Racism, prejudice, humiliation, they don't just hurt individuals. They destroy families, fracture communities, and weaken entire societies. Sophie's slap was more than an act of violence. It was a symbol of arrogance, of a belief that some lives deserve less dignity. But it backfired, because courage, even in silence, is stronger than hate. Because unity, between a father and son, between passengers who spoke up, between millions who watched, can turn humiliation into revolution. Marcus was right. If one slap could tear down an empire, then countless acts of dignity could build one greater than the world had ever seen. As the dust settled, Adrian sat once again by a window seat, staring out at the clouds. The world below had changed, but the sky remained the same, vast, endless, unbothered by the chaos of men. He closed his eyes, remembering his father's words. Son, dignity isn't given. It's defended. And he realized that sometimes the strongest defense isn't a raised fist. It's a raised standard, one slap, one call, one movement. The story of Flight 237 would be told for years, not as the downfall of an airline, but as the rise of a truth too powerful to be silenced, because racism destroys families. Prejudice weakens communities, but unity brings healing. And courage, quiet, unshakable courage, defeats hate.